When a drifter stumbles upon a dying woman and her newborn tied to a post in the middle of nowhere, he makes a choice that will destroy his peace forever. What starts as mercy becomes a war against wealth, power, and men who believe they can take whatever they want. One rifle, one promise, and a fight that will either kill him or give him the only thing he's never had, a reason to live. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The horse didn't want to go any further. Caleb Ward pulled the reins, felt the animal resist beneath him, hooves scraping against cracked earth like it knew something he didn't. The sun sat low and mean on the horizon, turning the sky into something ugly, rust and ash, the color of old blood. He'd been riding for 3 days through land that looked like it had given up on itself. Broken fences, collapsed barns, homesteads that had been abandoned so long the doors hung sideways on rotted hinges. He didn't blame them for leaving. Caleb was 32 and looked older. His face had that worn quality that came from sleeping rough and eating worse, lines carved deep around his eyes from squinting into too many hard miles. His coat was patched in 4 places, his boots held together with wire, and the rifle across his saddle was the only thing he owned that he took care of. He wasn't running from anything in particular, wasn't heading toward anything either. That was just how it had been for the last 8 years, drifting, working when he had to, moving when he didn't. No family, no home, nothing that tied him to any one place long enough to matter. The wind picked up, dragging dust across the flats in thin sheets that stung his face. He tugged his hat lower and was about to kick the horse forward when he saw it. A shape, maybe a 1/4 mile out. At first he thought it was a post, some kind of marker left behind by settlers who'd tried and failed to make something out of this godforsaken stretch. But then it moved, just slightly. Caleb went still. His hand drifted toward the rifle without him thinking about it. Out here, movement meant one of 2 things, animal or trouble. And animals didn't stand upright. He watched for a long moment, eyes narrowed, weighing his options. He could turn around, ride back the way he'd come and pretend he never saw anything. That would be the smart play, the safe play. But something about the way it moved, slow, weak, like it was struggling just to stay upright, got under his skin. He cursed under his breath and nudged the horse forward. The closer he got, the worse it looked. It wasn't a post. It was a woman. She was tied to a thick wooden stake driven into the ground, arms bound behind her, head slumped forward like she didn't have the strength to hold it up anymore. Her dress, what was left of it, was torn and filthy, streaked with dirt and something darker that looked like dried blood. Her feet were bare, skin cracked and raw from the sun. Caleb's gut tightened. He pulled the horse to a stop about 20 feet out and just sat there, scanning the area. This felt wrong, felt like bait, like someone had left her here on purpose, waiting for some fool to ride up and get himself shot. But there was no one, just empty land in every direction, and the wind, and the woman sagging against the ropes like she was barely holding on. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it, a cry, thin and desperate. Caleb's eyes dropped, and that's when he saw the bundle at her feet, a baby. It was lying in the dirt, wrapped in what looked like a torn piece of cloth, squirming weakly. The cry came again, barely more than a whimper, and Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. "Jesus," he muttered. He slid off the horse, rifle in hand, and approached slowly. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to turn around, but his legs kept moving. He reached the woman first, crouched down beside her, and touched her shoulder gently. "Hey," he said quietly. "You hear me?" Her head lifted just a fraction, enough for him to see her face. She was young, maybe mid-20s. Her skin was pale beneath the grime, lips cracked and bleeding, eyes glassy with fever or exhaustion or both. There was a bruise along her jaw, purple and swollen, and a cut above her eyebrow that had scabbed over badly. "Please," she whispered. The word came out rough, like her throat was full of sand. "My baby." Caleb looked down at the infant. It was still moving, still making those weak little sounds, but it didn't look good. The cloth it was wrapped in was too thin for the cold night that would come in a few hours, and its skin had that grayish tint that meant it wasn't getting enough of something. Warmth, milk, air, he didn't know. "Who did this?" Caleb asked, his voice harder now. The woman's eyes flickered, trying to focus on him. She coughed, a wet, rattling sound. They tried to kill me. Who? My husband's family. Her voice broke. They took her. I fought. They left us here. Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't need the whole story to know what kind of people would do this. Rich folks, probably. The kind who thought they owned everything, including the lives around them. He stood up, pulled his knife from his belt, and cut the ropes binding her wrists. She collapsed forward, and he caught her before she hit the ground. She weighed almost nothing. I've got you, he said, though he wasn't sure why. Wasn't sure what the hell he was doing at all. He laid her down gently, then picked up the baby. The moment he touched it, the crying stopped, and that scared him more than anything. He tucked the infant against his chest, trying to keep it warm, and looked around for anything useful. There was nothing. No horse. No supplies. No sign of whoever had done this. Just her, the baby, and a whole lot of empty land. Caleb looked down at the woman. Her eyes were closed now, breathing shallow. She might not make it through the night. The baby might not either. And he had a choice. He could leave them here. Right away. It wasn't his problem. He didn't owe these people anything. But even as he thought it, he knew he wasn't going to do that. He didn't know why. Maybe it was because he'd spent too many years with nothing and no one, and the idea of walking away from something that needed him, really needed him, felt worse than whatever trouble this would bring. Or maybe he was just tired of being the kind of man who rode past. Damn it, he muttered. He wrapped the baby tighter in his own coat, then carefully lifted the woman and draped her over the horse's back. She didn't wake up. He tied her down as gently as he could, then climbed up behind her, cradling the baby in one arm and holding the reins with the other. The horse shifted uneasily, but it moved when he asked it to. Caleb turned west toward the only shelter he knew, a cabin he'd been squatting in for the last 2 weeks. It was a half-day's ride, maybe more with the extra weight. He didn't look back. The cabin wasn't much. One room, a fireplace that barely worked, and a roof that leaked in 3 places. But it was dry, and it was hidden, tucked into a hollow between 2 low hills where no one would think to look. By the time they reached it, the sun was gone, and the temperature had dropped hard. Caleb's fingers were numb, and the baby had stopped making noise altogether, which terrified him. He got the woman inside first, laid her on the only bed, a sagging frame with a thin mattress that smelled like mildew. Then he built a fire, hands shaking from cold and adrenaline, and set the baby down near the heat. The infant's eyes were closed. Its breathing was so faint he had to put his hand on its chest to feel it. Come on, he said quietly. Don't quit now. He didn't know what else to do, so he found an old cloth, dampened it with water from his canteen, and tried to clean the baby's face. It stirred slightly, and relief flooded through him so fast it almost hurt. The woman hadn't moved. Caleb knelt beside the bed, checked her pulse. It was there, but weak. Her skin was burning hot to the touch. Fever, infection, maybe both. He peeled back part of her torn dress and found the wound. It was a knife cut, deep and jagged, running along her ribs. Someone had tried to gut her and almost succeeded. The edges were inflamed, oozing, and he could smell the infection even before he saw it. Hell, he breathed. He didn't have much in the way of supplies, a bottle of whiskey, some old bandages, a needle and thread he'd used to patch his coat. It would have to be enough. He poured whiskey over the wound first. The woman's body jerked, a low moan escaping her lips, but she didn't wake. He worked fast, cleaning as much as he could, then stitched the worst of it closed. His hands were steadier than he expected, muscle memory from a life that had required him to patch himself up more than once. When he was done, he wrapped her ribs as tightly as he dared and covered her with every blanket he had. Then he sat down by the fire, the baby in his lap, and waited. She woke 3 days later. Caleb was outside chopping wood when he heard the noise, a crash, something hitting the floor. He dropped the axe and ran inside. The woman was on the ground beside the bed, trying to crawl toward the door. Her face was twisted in pain, eyes wild and unfocused. Whoa, hey! Caleb crossed the room and crouched down in front of her. You're safe. You're okay. She didn't seem to hear him. Her hands scrabbled at the floor, nails digging into the wood. My baby, she gasped. Where? Right here. Caleb pointed to the makeshift crib he'd built near the fire. Just a crate lined with cloth. but it worked. The baby was asleep inside, wrapped in clean fabric, breathing evenly. The woman's eyes found the crib, and something in her face broke. She let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp, and collapsed forward. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground again. "Easy," he said. "You're still hurt. You need to rest." "Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Name's Caleb. I found you out past the flats. You and the baby." He helped her back onto the bed, moving slowly. "You've been out for 3 days." She stared at him, trying to make sense of it. "Why did you help me?" He didn't have a good answer for that. "Didn't seem right to leave you." She looked at him for a long moment, then closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent and steady. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb nodded, uncomfortable. "You need water, food. Can you sit up?" She tried, winced, but managed. He brought her a cup of water and some bread he'd soaked in broth to make it easier to eat. She took small bites, slow and careful, like her body had forgotten how. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena?" She paused. "Elena Cross?" "Cross." Caleb's expression darkened. "That the family you were talking about? The ones who did this?" She nodded. "My husband's family, Her voice broke. "They didn't want me, just the baby. They said I wasn't fit to raise her, that she belonged to them." "So they tried to kill you?" "Yes." The word came out flat, matter of fact, like she'd already accepted it. Caleb's hands curled into fists. "And your husband, dead." Elena's face went hard. "He died 6 months ago. His family blamed me, said I was poison. When I had the baby, they came for her. I ran." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't get far. They tied you to a post and left you to die. They thought I was already dead. I think—" She hesitated. "I think they were waiting to see if the baby would survive on her own, if she was strong enough to be a cross." Caleb felt his jaw tighten so hard it hurt. He'd seen a lot of cruelty in his life, but this was something else. This was cold, calculated. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. Elena looked toward the crib. "I haven't named her yet. I didn't think—" Her voice cracked. "I didn't think we'd make it this far." Caleb stood up, walked over to the crib, and looked down at the tiny sleeping face. The baby looked healthier now, color in her cheeks, breathing steady. "She's a fighter," he said. Elena nodded. "She is. You got somewhere to go? Anyone who'll take you in?" Elena shook her head. "No family, no money. The Cross family has everything, land, influence, the law in their pocket. If I show my face anywhere near their territory, they'll finish what they started." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You can stay here, for now." Elena looked at him, surprised. "Why would you do that?" He shrugged, uncomfortable again. "Like I said, didn't seem right to leave you. You don't know me." "No. I'm bringing you trouble." "Yeah," Caleb said. "Probably." Elena stared at him, searching his face for something. Deception, ulterior motive, anything that made sense. But all she saw was a tired man who looked like he'd been carrying his own weight for too long. "I don't understand you," she said finally. Caleb almost smiled. "That makes 2 of us." The days that followed settled into a fragile routine. Elena was weak, but she was stubborn. She insisted on helping with small things, folding cloth, mending tears in Caleb's coat, feeding the baby when she had the strength. Caleb hunted, chopped wood, kept the fire going, and tried not to think too hard about what he'd gotten himself into. They didn't talk much at first. Elena was guarded, wary, like she expected him to change his mind and throw her out. Caleb didn't push. He figured trust was something you earned, not demanded. But one night, about a week in, she spoke. They were sitting by the fire, the baby asleep between them. Elena had been quiet all evening, staring into the flames with that faraway look she got sometimes. "I was 17 when I married him," she said suddenly. Caleb looked up. "Thomas Cross," she continued. "He was older, wealthy, charming. My parents thought it was a good match. I thought—" She laughed bitterly. "I thought I loved him." "What changed?" "I saw who he really was, who they all were." She paused. "The Cross family owns half the county. They're used to getting what they want. And when Thomas died, I became a problem, a loose end." And the baby? She's a cross. Their blood. They wanted her raised their way, without me. Elena's voice hardened. They told me I could leave quietly, with money, and never see her again. Or I could refuse and see what happened. You refused. Of course I did. She looked at him. She's my daughter. Caleb nodded slowly. They'll come looking for you. I know. And when they find you, they won't ask twice. Elena met his eyes. I know. You're not afraid? She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm terrified, but I'm not giving her up. Caleb believed her. Winter came hard and fast. The first snow fell 2 weeks after Elena woke, and it didn't stop. The temperature dropped until the air itself felt sharp, and the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls like something alive. Caleb spent most of his time outside, hunting whatever he could find and keeping the firewood stocked. Elena took care of the baby, who was growing stronger every day, more alert, more active, crying louder when she was hungry. They started talking more. Small things at first. Where Caleb was from. Nowhere in particular. What Elena had wanted before everything went wrong. A quiet life. A garden. Time. And slowly, something shifted. It wasn't obvious, wasn't dramatic. But Caleb started to notice the way Elena smiled when the baby did something new. The way she laughed, really laughed, when he told a bad joke. The way she looked at him sometimes, like she was trying to figure him out and didn't mind the effort. And Elena noticed things too. The way Caleb always made sure she ate first. The way he sat up at night when the baby cried so she could sleep. The way he fixed things without being asked. Patched the roof, reinforced the door, built a better crib. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something. One night, when the wind was particularly bad, Elena asked, "Why did you really help me?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He poked at the fire, watching the embers glow. "I spent a long time not mattering to anyone," he said finally, "and I got used to it. But when I saw you out there..." He stopped. "I don't know. I guess I was tired of being the kind of man who walks away." Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're not what I expected." "What'd you expect?" "Someone looking for something in return." Caleb shook his head. "I'm not." "I know," she said softly. "That's why I'm still here." The baby started smiling in her second month. Elena cried the first time it happened, and Caleb didn't know what to do except sit there and let her. When she finally stopped, she looked at him with red eyes and said, "I want to name her." "Yeah?" "Hope." Caleb considered it. "That's a good name." Elena nodded. "She saved me. The moment I knew I was pregnant, I had a reason to keep going. And you..." She paused. "You gave us both a second chance. I didn't do much. You did everything." Caleb looked away, uncomfortable. "She's going to need more than what I can give her." "Maybe. But for now, this is enough." Spring came late. The snow melted slowly, turning the ground into thick mud that sucked at your boots. The wind lost its bite, and the sun started staying out longer. And with the thaw came the threat they'd both been waiting for. Caleb saw them first. He was out checking the traps when he spotted the riders, 3 of them, moving slow across the ridge about a mile out. They weren't hunting. They were searching. He ran back to the cabin. "They're here," he said. Elena's face went pale. She grabbed Hope, held her close. "How many?" "3 that I saw. Could be more." "What do we do?" Caleb grabbed his rifle, checked the load. "We get ready." Elena stood up, shaking but resolute. "I'm not running." "I know." "If they take her..." "They won't." Elena looked at him, and for the first time since he'd found her, he saw something other than fear in her eyes. Trust. "Okay," she said. Caleb moved to the window, watched the riders getting closer. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. He'd made a promise. Not out loud, but it was there, solid and unbreakable. He would stand between them and anyone who came, even if it killed him. The riders reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. Caleb raised the rifle and waited. The 3 riders sat motionless at the tree line, and Caleb could feel their eyes scanning the cabin like they were deciding whether it was worth the trouble. He didn't move, didn't breathe louder than he had to. His finger rested against the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself, not yet, but close enough that the distance didn't matter. Behind him, Elena had gone completely still. Hope was quiet too, like even the baby understood that sound was dangerous right now. One of the riders dismounted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that looked too expensive for this kind of country. The other two stayed on their horses, hands resting near their belts in a way that wasn't casual. The tall one started walking toward the cabin. Caleb shifted his weight, angling the rifle so the barrel caught the light coming through the window. A warning. The man saw it and stopped about 30 yards out. "Anyone home?" he called. His voice was smooth, educated, the kind of voice that was used to being listened to. Caleb didn't answer. The man took another step. "I'm looking for someone. A woman. Dark hair, mid-20s. She might be injured, might have a child with her." Still, Caleb said nothing. The man's expression tightened just slightly. "My name is Richard Cross. The woman I'm looking for is family. We're concerned about her well-being." That was when Caleb spoke. "Turn around." His voice was flat, cold, and it carried across the clearing like a stone hitting ice. Richard Cross paused. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think you understand the situation, friend. The woman is sick, confused. She took something that doesn't belong to her, and we just want to bring her home. She's not going anywhere. You're harboring a fugitive." "She's not a fugitive. She's a woman you tried to kill." The smile vanished. Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment the mask slipped. Caleb saw what was underneath: arrogance, anger, and the kind of entitlement that came from never being told no. "You don't know what you're talking about," Richard said. "I know enough." "Then you know you're making a mistake." Caleb's voice didn't change. "Last chance, turn around." Richard stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at the two men on horseback and gave a small nod. They turned and rode away. But Caleb knew they weren't gone. He watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then lowered the rifle and stepped back from the window. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline catching up to him all at once. Elena was sitting on the floor, clutching Hope so tightly the baby started to fuss. Her face was white, eyes wide. "They found us," she whispered. "Yeah. They'll come back." "I know." Elena looked up at him, and the fear in her expression was so raw it made something twist in his chest. "You should leave. Take what you can and go. They'll kill you if you stay." Caleb crouched down in front of her, met her eyes. "I'm not leaving." "Caleb, I'm not leaving," he said again, harder this time. "You hear me? I made a choice when I brought you here, and I'm not walking away from it now." "Why?" Her voice broke. "You don't owe me anything. You don't even know me." He didn't have a good answer for that. Didn't know how to explain that for the first time in 8 years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, that the idea of riding away and leaving her to face this alone made him feel sick. So he just said, "I know enough." Elena stared at him, and something shifted in her face. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something else, something stronger. "Okay," she said quietly. Caleb nodded and stood up. "We need to be ready. They'll come back, probably with more men, and next time they won't ask politely." "What do we do?" "We make it hard for them." Over the next 2 days, Caleb turned the cabin into something that could hold against an attack. He reinforced the door with extra boards, nailed shutters over the windows that could be barred from the inside, and moved anything useful, food, water, ammunition, into the main room where they could reach it quickly. Elena helped where she could, though she was still weak. Mostly she stayed inside with Hope, watching through the cracks in the shutters, waiting. The tension was suffocating. Every sound made them jump. Every shadow that moved outside sent Caleb's hand to his rifle. They barely slept, taking turns keeping watch, and when they did sleep, it was light and restless. On the third day, Caleb was outside checking the perimeter when he heard hoofbeats. This time, there were more of them. He counted 6 riders coming down from the ridge, moving fast. Richard Cross was at the front, and the men with him didn't look like ranch hands. They looked like hired guns, hard faces, cold eyes, rifles slung across their saddles. Caleb ran back to the cabin, slammed the door, and dropped the bar across it. "They're here," he said. Elena grabbed Hope and moved to the corner farthest from the door, crouching low. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. Caleb took position at the window, rifle ready. The riders stopped about 50 yards out. Richard dismounted again, but this time he didn't come closer. He just stood there, hands at his sides, and called out, "Last chance, friend. Send the woman and the child out, and we'll leave you alone." Caleb didn't answer. "You're protecting a thief and a liar," Richard continued, raising his voice. "That child is cross-blood. She belongs with her family, not some drifter living in a shack." Still, Caleb stayed silent. Richard's expression hardened. "Have it your way." He stepped back, and one of the men raised his rifle. Caleb fired first. The shot cracked through the air, and the man's horse reared, throwing him sideways. He hit the ground hard, scrambling for cover as the other riders scattered. "Stay down!" Caleb shouted over his shoulder. Elena pressed herself against the wall, covering Hope's head with her arms. Another shot rang out, this one from outside. The bullet punched through the shutter and buried itself in the wall above Elena's head. She flinched, but didn't scream. Caleb fired again, aiming for the horses this time. One of them went down, throwing its rider, and the rest of the men dove behind rocks and trees, using the terrain for cover. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then the shooting started in earnest. Bullets tore through the cabin walls, splintering wood, shattering what was left of the windows. Caleb moved fast, firing from different angles, trying to keep them from pinning him down. He didn't aim to kill, just to make them think twice about rushing the door. But they had numbers, and they had patience. The firefight stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Caleb's ears were ringing, his hands slick with sweat, and the cabin smelled like gunpowder and fear. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the shooting stopped. Caleb risked a glance through the shutter. The men had pulled back, regrouping behind the ridge. Richard was with them, gesturing sharply, giving orders. "They're not leaving," Elena said quietly. "No," Caleb agreed. "They're waiting us out." "How long can we hold?" Caleb looked at the ammunition he had left. Maybe another day if they were lucky. "Not long enough." Elena closed her eyes, and for a moment she looked like she was going to break. But then she opened them again, and the fear was gone. In its place was something harder, something that looked like resolve. "I'm going out there," she said. "Like hell you are. If I go, maybe they'll leave you alone. They'll kill you. Maybe, but at least Hope will be alive." Caleb turned to face her fully. "You think they're going to let you walk away? You think Richard Cross is going to hand you money and a fresh start after everything that's happened?" He shook his head. "They'll take the baby and they'll put you in the ground. That's the deal." Elena's hands curled into fists. "Then what do we do?" Before Caleb could answer, a voice called out from outside. "I'm offering you one more chance." It was Richard again, closer now. Caleb moved to the window and saw him standing in the open, no weapon in his hands, looking directly at the cabin. "You've put up a good fight," Richard said. "I respect that. But this ends one way or another. Either you send them out, or we burn you out. Your choice." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Think about it," Richard continued. "You're not her husband. You're not the child's father. This isn't your fight. Walk away and I'll make sure you're compensated. Hell, I'll even forget this ever happened." For a moment, Caleb didn't move. Then he raised the rifle and fired. The bullet hit the ground 2 feet in front of Richard, kicking up dirt. Richard stumbled back, eyes wide, and the men behind him raised their weapons. But Caleb wasn't done. "You want them?" he shouted. "You come through me!" Richard stared at him, and for the first time Caleb saw genuine surprise on the man's face, like he couldn't believe someone would actually refuse him. Then the surprise turned to rage. "Burn it," Richard said. One of the men pulled something from his saddlebag, a bottle with a rag stuffed in the top. He lit it, and the flame caught instantly. Caleb's heart sank. The man threw the bottle, and it arced through the air, spinning end over end before smashing against the side of the cabin. Fire exploded across the wall, spreading fast. "Out the back!" Caleb yelled. He grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her toward the rear of the cabin. She stumbled, clutching Hope, and Caleb kicked open the back door just as the flames started eating through the front wall. They ran. The air outside was cold and sharp, and Caleb's lungs burned as he dragged Elena toward the tree line. Behind them, the cabin groaned and cracked as the fire consumed it. Gunfire erupted again, bullets chewing up the ground around them. Caleb fired back blindly, just trying to buy them time. They made it into the trees, and Caleb pushed Elena behind a fallen log, covering her and the baby with his body. "Stay down," he said. The shooting continued for another few seconds, then stopped. Caleb risked a look. The men were regrouping again, but they weren't chasing. Not yet. Why aren't they coming? Elena whispered. Caleb didn't know. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats. A lot of them. But not from the crossmen, from the opposite direction. A moment later, a group of riders crested the hill. 7 of them, wearing badges, led by a man with a thick gray beard and a shotgun across his saddle. The law. Richard Cross saw them too, and his face went tight. He said something to his men, and they holstered their weapons, stepping back like they'd just been out for a casual ride. The lawman rode straight up to Richard, looked at the burning cabin, then at the armed men standing around like they had nothing to hide. "Richard," the lawman said, his voice flat. "What the hell is going on here?" "Sheriff Dalton." Richard's tone shifted instantly, smooth and reasonable. "Just a misunderstanding. We were trying to retrieve stolen property." "Stolen property?" Dalton didn't sound convinced. "My late brother's child. The woman inside kidnapped her." Dalton looked at the cabin, still burning. "Doesn't look like there's anyone inside now." "She ran." Richard gestured toward the trees. "With the help of some drifter who's been hiding her." Dalton's eyes scanned the tree line, and Caleb knew he'd been spotted. Slowly, he stood up, rifle still in hand but pointed at the ground. "That you?" Dalton called. Caleb stepped out from behind the log, keeping Elena and Hope behind him. "Yeah." "You got a name?" "Caleb Ward." Dalton studied him for a moment. "You the one who fired first?" "They came at us armed," Caleb said evenly. "I defended myself." "Is that true, Richard?" Richard's expression didn't change. "He's lying. We came peacefully, and he opened fire without provocation." Dalton looked between them, clearly weighing the situation. Then his eyes landed on Elena, still crouched behind the log with Hope in her arms. "That the woman you're talking about?" "Yes," Richard said quickly. "Elena Cross. She's not well, Sheriff. She needs help." "She looks fine to me." "She's confused, dangerous. She attacked members of my family and fled with the child." Elena stood up slowly, and Caleb saw her hands shaking, but when she spoke, her voice was clear. "That's a lie." Every eye turned to her. "They tried to kill me," she continued, stepping forward. "They stabbed me and left me tied to a post in the middle of nowhere with my baby at my feet. If this man hadn't found us, we'd be dead." Richard's face darkened. "That's absurd." "Is it?" Elena pulled aside the collar of her dress, revealing the scar along her ribs, still red, still angry. "This is where they cut me. Your men did this." Dalton's expression shifted. He looked at Richard. "That true?" "Of course not. I want to hear it from your men." Richard hesitated, and that hesitation said everything. Dalton turned his horse toward the armed men. "Any of you want to tell me what happened?" None of them spoke. "Thought so." Dalton looked back at Richard. "You're done here. Take your men and leave." "Sheriff, you don't understand." "I understand plenty. You just tried to burn down a cabin with people inside. That's arson. Could be attempted murder depending on how generous I'm feeling." Dalton's hand rested on his shotgun. "Now get out of here before I decide to arrest the lot of you." Richard's jaw clenched so hard Caleb thought he might crack a tooth, but he nodded, mounted his horse, and gestured for his men to follow. Before he left, he looked at Elena one last time. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Then he rode away. Dalton watched them go, then turned back to Caleb and Elena. "You two all right?" "We're fine," Caleb said. "Good." Dalton dismounted, walked over, and looked at the baby in Elena's arms. "That the child they were after?" "Yes. She looks healthy." "She is." Dalton nodded slowly. "You've got yourself a problem. Richard Cross owns half the county, and he doesn't like losing. He'll come at you again, and next time, I might not be around to stop it." "I know," Elena said. "So what are you going to do?" Elena looked at Caleb, then back at Dalton. "I'm going to fight him." Dalton raised an eyebrow. "Fight him how?" "Publicly, legally. I'm going to expose what they did and make sure everyone knows the truth. That's a dangerous game. I don't have a choice." Dalton studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. If you're serious, I know a judge in Silver Creek who might listen. Man named Harper. He's fair, and he doesn't owe the Cross family anything." "How far is Silver Creek?" 3 days' ride. Maybe 4 with a baby." Elena looked down at Hope, then at the smoldering remains of the cabin. Everything they had was gone: food, supplies, shelter. They had nothing except what they were carrying, but she didn't hesitate. "We'll go," she said. Caleb stepped forward. "We'll need horses, supplies." Dalton considered it, then gestured to one of his men. "Get them 2 horses and enough provisions for a week. Put it on the county tab." The deputy looked confused but didn't argue. "Thank you," Elena said. Dalton shrugged. "Don't thank me yet. If Richard finds out I helped you, this gets a lot more complicated." He paused. "But I've known the Cross family a long time, and they're not good people. If you've got a chance to knock them down a peg, I'm not going to stand in your way." An hour later, Caleb and Elena were on horseback, heading west toward Silver Creek. Hope was strapped to Elena's chest in a makeshift sling, and their saddlebags were packed with enough food and water to last a few days. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, and the air was cold enough that Caleb could see his breath. They rode in silence for the first hour. Then Elena spoke. "You didn't have to come." Caleb glanced at her. "Yeah, I did." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because I'm tired of running from things that matter." Elena looked at him, and for a moment something passed between them, an understanding, quiet and unspoken. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said. "Neither do I. They could kill us." "Yeah. And you're still here." Caleb nodded. "Still here." Elena's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just reached over and touched his hand briefly, a small gesture that carried more weight than words. "Thank you," she said. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and kept riding. The next 3 days were hard. The terrain was rough, the weather unpredictable, and they had to stop frequently to feed Hope and let the horses rest. Caleb hunted when he could, bringing back rabbits and birds that they cooked over small fires at night. They talked more during those long stretches of riding. Elena told him about her life before Thomas Cross, growing up poor, working in her father's store, dreaming of something bigger. Caleb told her about the years he'd spent drifting, working ranches and mines, never staying long enough to put down roots. "Why not?" Elena asked. Caleb shrugged. "Didn't see the point. Everywhere I went, people either wanted something from me or didn't want me at all. Got tired of both." "And now?" "Now I'm here." Elena smiled faintly. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." On the 4th day, they reached Silver Creek. It was a small town, maybe 200 people, built along a river that cut through the valley. The buildings were worn but sturdy, and the streets were busy with wagons and foot traffic. Caleb and Elena rode straight to the sheriff's office, where Dalton had said they'd find Judge Harper. The man who answered the door was older, maybe 60, with wire-rimmed glasses and a stern expression that softened when he saw Hope. "You must be the woman Dalton told me about," Harper said. "Yes, sir," Elena replied. "My name is Elena Cross." "Come inside." They followed him into a small office cluttered with papers and books. Harper gestured for them to sit, then settled into his chair and folded his hands. "Dalton's message said you are accusing the Cross family of attempted murder. That's a serious claim." "It's the truth." "Can you prove it?" Elena hesitated. "I have the scars. And I have him." She gestured to Caleb. "He found me tied to a post, left to die. He's a witness." Harper looked at Caleb. "Is that accurate?" "Every word," Caleb said. Harper leaned back, thinking. "The Cross family has significant influence. If you go public with this, they'll fight back hard. Are you prepared for that?" "I don't have a choice," Elena said. "If I don't fight, they'll take my daughter." Harper studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, I'll schedule a hearing. We'll present your case, and if there's enough evidence, we'll move forward with charges." Elena's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Harper said. "This is just the beginning." He was right. The hearing was set for 2 weeks later, and in that time the Cross family made their move. They filed counterclaims accusing Elena of kidnapping, theft, and mental instability. They brought in doctors who swore she was unfit to care for a child. They spread rumors through the town, painting her as a dangerous woman who'd seduced their son and then destroyed him. It was vicious and coordinated, and it worked. Public opinion started to shift. People who'd been sympathetic at first began to doubt. Whispers followed Elena whenever she walked through town, and more than once, Caleb caught people staring at them with suspicion. But Elena didn't break. She met with Harper almost every day, building her case piece by piece. She found witnesses, people who'd seen her injuries, who'd heard the Cross family's threats. She wrote down everything she could remember, every detail, every lie they'd told. And Caleb stood by her through all of it. He didn't know much about law or courtrooms, but he knew how to be steady, how to be there when things got hard. One night, a week before the hearing, they were sitting in the small room they'd rented above the general store. Hope was asleep in a crib someone had donated, and Elena was staring at a stack of papers, looking exhausted. "I don't know if this is going to work," she said quietly. Caleb looked up from where he was cleaning his rifle. "It will." "How do you know?" "Because you're not giving up." Elena laughed bitterly. "That's not enough." "It's more than most people have." She looked at him, and something in her expression cracked. "What if I lose her?" Caleb set down the rifle and crossed the room. He crouched in front of her, meeting her eyes. "You won't," he said. "You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise I'll be there, whatever happens." Elena's eyes filled with tears, and this time she didn't try to stop them. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his shoulder, and Caleb wrapped his arms around her. They stayed like that for a long time, holding on to each other in the quiet. And somewhere in that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was something deeper, something that felt like home. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray, the kind of day where the sun never quite broke through the clouds. Caleb woke before dawn and found Elena already dressed, sitting by the window with Hope in her arms, staring out at the empty street below. "You sleep at all?" he asked. She shook her head. Couldn't. He understood. He'd barely managed a few hours himself, his mind turning over everything that could go wrong. The hearing wasn't a trial, not yet, but it would determine whether one happened. If Judge Harper decided there wasn't enough evidence, the whole thing would collapse before it even started. Caleb crossed the room and stood beside her. "You ready?" Elena looked down at Hope, who was still sleeping, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. "I have to be." They left the baby with Mrs. Garrett, the woman who ran the general store. She'd been one of the few people in town who hadn't turned cold when the rumors started spreading, and she'd offered to watch Hope without being asked. "You go do what you need to do," Mrs. Garrett said, taking the baby gently. "I'll keep her safe." Elena's hands lingered on Hope for a moment longer than necessary, like she was afraid to let go. Then she nodded and stepped back. "Thank you," she said quietly. The courthouse was a squat brick building at the center of town, and by the time they arrived, there was already a crowd gathering outside. Word had spread fast. Everyone in Silver Creek knew about the hearing, and half the county had showed up to watch. Caleb scanned the faces as they pushed through. Most were curious, some sympathetic, but a few looked hostile. He recognized a couple of men wearing Cross family colors, ranch hands probably, sent here to intimidate. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every bench was full, people standing along the walls, and the air smelled like sweat and old wood. At the front of the room, Judge Harper sat behind a heavy oak desk, his expression unreadable. On the left side sat Elena's lawyer, a young man named Tom Brennan, who'd taken the case pro bono after hearing her story. He looked nervous, shuffling papers, glancing at Elena like he wasn't sure they had a chance. On the right side sat the Cross family's legal team. 3 men in expensive suits, led by a sharp-eyed lawyer named Vincent Moss, who had a reputation for never losing. And behind them, sitting in the front row with his hands folded like he didn't have a care in the world, was Richard Cross. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. Richard's eyes found Elena, and he smiled. Not warm, not kind, just the faint curl of someone who thought they'd already won. Elena didn't look away. She met his gaze, held it, and after a moment, Richard's smile faltered. "All rise," someone called, and the room went quiet. Judge Harper stood, surveyed the crowd, then sat back down. "This is a preliminary hearing to determine whether there is sufficient cause to bring formal charges against members of the Cross family for attempted murder and conspiracy. We're not here to decide guilt or innocence, just whether the case has merit. Keep that in mind." He gestured to Brennan. "Counsel, you may begin." Brennan stood, cleared his throat, and started laying out Elena's story. He spoke carefully, methodically, walking through the timeline. Her marriage to Thomas Cross, his death, the family's demand that she give up hope, and finally, the attack that left her for dead. Miss Cross was found tied to a post in the wilderness, Brennan said, his voice gaining confidence. She'd been stabbed, abandoned, and left to die alongside her infant daughter. If not for the intervention of Mr. Caleb Ward, both would have perished. He gestured to Caleb, and every eye in the room turned toward him. Caleb didn't move, just sat there, steady, letting them look. Brennan continued. We have physical evidence, scars consistent with her account. We have witness testimony. And we have the Cross family's own actions, including an armed assault on Mr. Ward's property and an attempt to burn them alive. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harper banged his gavel once. Order! Brennan sat down, and Vincent Moss stood up. He moved like a man who owned the room, slow, deliberate, confident. He buttoned his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and smiled at the judge like they were old friends. Your Honor, Moss began, his voice smooth as glass. What we have here is a tragic misunderstanding, compounded by the delusions of a grieving widow. Elena's hands clenched in her lap. Mrs. Cross suffered a terrible loss when her husband died, Moss continued. In her grief, she became unstable. She accused the family of trying to harm her, despite their repeated attempts to help. When they tried to intervene, peacefully, I might add, she fled with the child and sought refuge with a man of questionable character. He glanced at Caleb. A drifter. A man with no ties to this community, no history, and no reason to involve himself except perhaps for financial gain. Caleb felt his temper flare, but he kept his face blank. Moss turned back to the judge. The so-called attack at Mr. Ward's cabin was an attempt by the family to retrieve the child, their blood, their responsibility, from a dangerous situation. Mr. Ward opened fire without provocation. He is the aggressor here, not the Cross family. That's a lie, Elena said, her voice cutting through the room. Harper's gavel came down again. Miss Cross, you'll have your chance to speak. Moss smiled faintly. Your Honor, we have medical experts prepared to testify that Mrs. Cross is suffering from severe emotional distress and is unfit to care for an infant. We have witnesses who will attest to her erratic behavior, and we have the family's sworn statements that they acted only out of concern for the child's well-being. He sat down, looking satisfied. Brennan stood again. Your Honor, I'd like to call Elena Cross to testify. Harper nodded. Proceed. Elena stood, walked to the front of the room, and placed her hand on the Bible. Her voice was steady as she swore to tell the truth. And when she sat down in the witness chair, she looked directly at Moss. Brennan started gently. Miss Cross, can you tell us what happened the day you were attacked? Elena took a breath. I was at the Cross estate. Richard and 2 other men came to my room. They said I had one last chance to give up my daughter and leave quietly. I refused. What happened next? They grabbed me. I fought back. One of them, Marcus, I think his name was, pulled a knife. He stabbed me. She touched her side. Right here. Then they dragged me outside, tied me to a horse, and rode for hours. When we stopped, they tied me to a post and left. And the baby? They took her from my arms and put her on the ground. I thought... Her voice cracked. I thought they were going to let her die out there, to see if she was strong enough to survive. The courtroom was dead silent. Brennan let the moment hang, then asked, Why do you think they did this? Because I wasn't one of them. I was poor, didn't come from the right family. They tolerated me when Thomas was alive, but after he died, I was just a problem. And Hope, she's a Cross. They wanted her raised their way, without me. Moss stood. Objection, speculation. Harper nodded. Sustained. Stick to what you know, Miss Cross. Brennan asked a few more questions, then sat down. Moss rose, and his expression shifted, no longer smooth but sharp, predatory. Miss Cross, he began, you claim you were attacked, yet you have no witnesses. No one saw this alleged assault except you. Mr. Ward found me. After the fact. He didn't see the attack itself, did he? No, but... So we only have your word. Elena's jaw tightened. Yes, and your word, frankly, is questionable. Moss picked up a piece of paper. We have statements from 3 doctors who examined you after your husband's death. All of them noted signs of severe depression, anxiety, and paranoia. I wasn't paranoid. They were threatening me. Or you were imagining threats where none existed. Moss leaned forward. Isn't it true that you tried to leave the estate multiple times before the alleged attack? Because I didn't feel safe. Or because you were planning to abscond with the child. That's not... Isn't it also true that you struck a member of the household staff during an argument? Elena hesitated. I pushed someone who was trying to take hope from me. So you admit to being violent. I was defending my daughter. Moss smiled thinly. Of course. Just as you're defending yourself now with wild accusations against a respected family. Brennan shot to his feet. Your Honor, he's badgering the witness. I'm establishing credibility, Moss said calmly. Harper sighed. Move on, Mr. Moss. Moss asked a few more questions, each one designed to chip away at Elena's story, to make her sound unreliable, unstable, desperate. By the time he finished, Elena looked drained, her hands trembling in her lap. But she didn't break. Brennan called Caleb next. Caleb walked to the stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and sat down. He didn't look at Richard Cross, didn't look at Moss, just kept his eyes on Brennan. Mr. Ward, Brennan said, can you describe the condition Miss Cross was in when you found her? She was half dead, Caleb said bluntly. Tied to a post, bleeding, barely conscious. The baby was on the ground, not moving much. If I'd been an hour later, they'd both be gone. And the wound on her side? Deep, infected. I stitched it myself because there wasn't anyone else. Did she say who did it? She said it was the Cross family. Moss stood. Hearsay. Harper nodded. Sustained. Brennan tried a different angle. Mr. Ward, when the Cross family came to your cabin, what happened? They showed up armed, demanded I hand over Elena and the baby. I refused. They opened fire, tried to burn us out. Did you fire first? Caleb paused. Yeah, I did. Murmurs spread through the room. Moss looked pleased. But they were armed, Caleb continued. 6 men with rifles, coming at a cabin with a woman and a baby inside. I wasn't about to wait and see what they'd do. Brennan nodded. Thank you, Mr. Ward. Moss stood for cross-examination, and his smile was sharp. Mr. Ward, you describe yourself as a drifter, correct? I move around, yeah. No permanent residence, no steady employment. I work when I need to. And yet you've been living in that cabin, illegally, I might add, for several weeks. Caleb shrugged. No one was using it. Convenient, Moss paced. Tell me, Mr. Ward, what exactly motivated you to involve yourself in this situation? I saw someone who needed help. Or you saw an opportunity. Caleb's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? The Cross family is wealthy. Perhaps you thought Miss Cross might be grateful. Perhaps you thought there was something to gain. Caleb's voice went cold. I didn't ask her for anything. Not yet. Brennan stood. Objection. He's implying facts not in evidence. Withdrawn, Moss said smoothly. He turned back to Caleb. Mr. Ward, have you ever been arrested? Caleb hesitated. Once. For what? Bar fight, 8 years ago. Charges were dropped. But you have a history of violence. I have a history of defending myself. Moss smiled. Of course. He asked a few more questions, painting Caleb as a violent drifter with no credibility, then sat down looking satisfied. Judge Harper called a recess. During the break, Caleb and Elena sat outside on the courthouse steps. The crowd had thinned, but there were still people watching, whispering. They're tearing us apart, Elena said quietly. They're trying. It's working. Caleb looked at her. You did good in there. I sounded crazy. You sounded like someone telling the truth. Elena laughed bitterly. That's not enough. Before Caleb could respond, Brennan came outside, his face tight. We've got a problem, he said. What kind of problem? Moss just filed a motion to have the case dismissed. He's arguing there's no physical evidence tying the Cross family to the attack, and without that, it's just your word against theirs. Elena's face went pale. Can he do that? He can try. Harper's reviewing it now. They sat in tense silence for the next 20 minutes. Then the bailiff called them back inside. Judge Harper looked tired. He shuffled papers, adjusted his glasses, and finally spoke. "I've reviewed the motion," he said, "and I've considered the testimony presented today. This is a difficult case. We have compelling testimony from Miss Cross and Mr. Ward, but we also have significant questions about credibility and motive." Elena's hands gripped the edge of the bench. "However," Harper continued, "I believe there is enough here to warrant further investigation. I'm denying the motion to dismiss." Relief flooded through Caleb like a wave. "But," Harper said, raising a hand, "I'm also ordering a full psychiatric evaluation of Miss Cross before we proceed to trial. If the doctors determine she is unfit, custody of the child will be transferred to the Cross family pending the outcome of the case." Elena stood up. "No, you can't. Miss Cross, sit down. They'll lie. They'll pay the doctors to say whatever they want." "Miss Cross," Harper's voice was firm, "I understand your concerns, but this is the fairest way forward. If you're telling the truth, the evaluation will support that." Elena looked like she was going to argue, but Brennan put a hand on her arm and shook his head. She sat down, trembling. Harper banged his gavel. "We'll reconvene in 2 weeks. Court is adjourned." The room erupted in noise, people standing, talking, moving toward the exits. Richard Cross stood and straightened his jacket, and as he walked past Elena, he leaned down and said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Elena's face went white. Caleb stepped forward, but Richard was already walking away, surrounded by his lawyers and guards. "What did he say?" Caleb asked. Elena didn't answer. She just stood there, staring after him, her whole body shaking. Outside, the crowd had grown. People pressed close, shouting questions, and Caleb had to push through to get Elena away from them. They made it back to the general store, where Mrs. Garrett was waiting with hope. "How did it go?" she asked. Elena took the baby and held her close, not answering. Mrs. Garrett looked at Caleb, and he just shook his head. That night, Elena barely spoke. She fed Hope, rocked her to sleep, and sat by the window staring out at nothing. Caleb gave her space for a while, but eventually he couldn't stand the silence. "What did Richard say to you?" he asked. Elena didn't look at him. "He said it doesn't matter what the judge decides. He said they'll take her one way or another, and if I keep fighting, they'll make sure I never see her again." Caleb's hands curled into fists. "He's trying to scare you. It's working. Don't let him win." Elena finally turned to face him, and her eyes were full of something raw and desperate. "What if I can't beat them, Caleb? What if I go through all of this, and they still take her?" "Then we'll figure something else out." "Like what?" Caleb didn't have an answer for that. Elena looked back out the window. "Maybe I should just take the money. Take Hope and leave. Start over somewhere they can't find us." "You really think they'd let you go?" "No." She closed her eyes. "But at least I'd have tried." Caleb crossed the room and crouched in front of her. "You're not running. Not after everything we've been through." "I'm scared." "I know. But you're also the strongest person I've ever met, and I'm not letting you give up." Elena looked at him, and something in her face shifted. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I care about you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Elena leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't planned, wasn't smooth, just a desperate, clumsy press of lips that lasted maybe 3 seconds before she pulled back, eyes wide. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have—" Caleb kissed her back. This time it was slower, deeper, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "I care about you too," Elena whispered. Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "Then we fight. Together." Elena nodded, and for the first time that day, she looked like she believed it. Over the next 2 weeks, they prepared for the psychiatric evaluation. Brennan coached Elena on what to expect, what questions they'd ask, how to stay calm. Caleb stayed close, keeping an eye out for trouble. And trouble came. 3 days before the evaluation, someone tried to break into their room. Caleb woke to the sound of the doorknob rattling and was on his feet with his rifle before his brain fully caught up. He yanked the door open and found a man in a dark coat stumbling back, startled. "Who the hell are you?" Caleb demanded. The man didn't answer, just turned and ran. Caleb chased him into the street, but the man disappeared into an alley, and Caleb lost him in the dark. When he got back, Elena was standing by the crib, holding Hope, her face pale. "They're not going to stop," she said. "No," Caleb agreed. "They're not." The next day, Caleb went to see Sheriff Dalton. "I need you to keep an eye on Elena," he said. "Someone tried to break in last night." Dalton frowned. "You see who it was?" "No, but I know who sent him." "I can't arrest Richard Cross on a hunch. I'm not asking you to arrest him. I'm asking you to make sure Elena stays safe." Dalton studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll post a deputy outside the general store. But Caleb, you need to understand, this town is small, and the Cross family is powerful. If things escalate, I can only do so much." "I know." "So what's your plan?" Caleb didn't have one. Not really, but he said, "We win the case. We expose them, and we make sure everyone knows what they did." Dalton didn't look convinced. "And if you lose?" Caleb met his eyes. "We won't." The day of the evaluation arrived. Elena was examined by 2 doctors, one chosen by her, one by the Cross family. They asked her questions for hours, probing her mental state, her history, her relationship with the family. Caleb waited outside, pacing, unable to sit still. When it was finally over, Elena came out looking exhausted but steady. "How'd it go?" he asked. "I don't know. They didn't give anything away." The results would take a week, 7 days of waiting, 7 days of not knowing. On the 5th day, Elena made a decision. "I'm going public," she said. Caleb looked up from where he was cleaning his rifle. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm going to tell everyone. The whole town. I'm going to stand in the middle of the street and tell them exactly what the Cross family did." "Elena, that's dangerous." "I don't care. I'm tired of hiding, tired of letting them control the narrative." She stood up, her jaw set. "If I'm going down fighting." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to tell her it was a bad idea, but he also understood it. Sometimes you had to make noise, had to force people to see. "Okay," he said, "then let's do it right." They spent the next day spreading the word. Caleb talked to everyone he could find, shopkeepers, ranch hands, people passing through. Elena wrote out her story by hand and posted copies around town. By the time the sun set, half of Silver Creek knew there was going to be a speech the next morning, and the other half would find out soon enough. The next morning, Elena stood in front of the courthouse with Hope in her arms and a crowd of maybe 50 people gathered around. Caleb stood beside her, rifle in hand, scanning the crowd for trouble. Elena took a breath and started speaking. "My name is Elena Cross," she said, her voice carrying across the square. "And I'm here to tell you the truth about the family that tried to kill me." People stopped, listened. She told them everything. The abuse, the threats, the attack, the fire. She didn't hold back, didn't soften it, just laid it all out in plain language. By the time she finished, the crowd had grown to over 100. Some looked shocked, some looked angry, and some looked like they'd suspected all along. Then Richard Cross arrived. He pushed through the crowd with his lawyers and guards, his face tight with fury. "This is slander," he said loudly. "Everything she's saying is a lie." Elena didn't flinch. "Then prove it." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake." "No," Elena said. "You made the mistake when you thought I'd stay quiet." For a moment, it looked like Richard might do something violent. His hands clenched, his jaw tight, and Caleb's finger moved closer to the trigger. But then Richard seemed to remember where he was. He forced a smile, turned to the crowd, and said, "This woman is unstable, desperate. She's trying to manipulate you into believing her lies because she knows she's going to lose." He gestured to his lawyers. "We have proof, medical records, witness statements, and when the court sees them, this farce will be over." He turned and walked away, but the damage was done. The crowd was talking now, debating, arguing. Some believed Elena. Some didn't, but everyone was listening, and that was enough. That night, everything changed. Caleb was sitting by the window, watching the street below, when he saw the shadows moving. 3 men, maybe 4, staying close to the buildings, trying not to be seen. He reached for his rifle. "Elena," he said quietly, "get Hope and get in the corner." She didn't ask questions, just scooped up the baby and moved to the far side of the room, pressing herself against the wall. Caleb moved to the door, listening. He could hear footsteps on the stairs now, slow and deliberate, trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. Then someone tried the handle. It was locked, but that didn't stop them. There was a scraping sound, a knife sliding into the gap between door and frame, working the latch. Caleb raised the rifle and aimed at chest height. The door swung open. The first man through didn't even see Caleb before the rifle barrel was pressed against his sternum. "Don't!" Caleb said. The man froze. Behind him, two others stumbled to a halt, hands moving toward their belts. "Don't do that either," Caleb said, his voice flat. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of the men in back spoke, his voice shaking slightly. "We're just here to deliver a message." "From who?" "Mr. Cross. He wants to talk." "Then he can come himself." "He's waiting downstairs. Alone. No weapons." Caleb didn't believe that for a second, but he also knew this was going to keep happening until something broke. He looked at Elena. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me." "Caleb, don't." "I'll be fine." He pushed past the men and headed downstairs, rifle still in hand. Sure enough, Richard Cross was standing in the street outside the general store, hands in his pockets, looking calm as you please. Two of his men stood a few yards back, armed but not pointing anything. Caleb stepped outside and stopped about 10 feet away. "You've got 1 minute," he said. Richard smiled faintly. "I'll make it quick then. I'm here to make you an offer." "Not interested. You haven't heard it yet." "Don't need to." Richard's smile thinned. $5,000, cash. You take it, walk away, and forget this ever happened. Caleb stared at him. "You think you can buy me off. I think you're a practical man. 5,000 is more money than you'll see in 10 years of drifting. Take it. Start a new life somewhere else. No one has to get hurt. Except Elena. Elena will be fine. We'll make sure she's taken care of. Right. Like you took care of her before." Richard's expression hardened. That was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that left her bleeding in the dirt. "She's unstable. The doctors will confirm that." "You paid them to say it. I paid them to tell the truth." Richard took a step closer. "Listen to me. You're in over your head. This isn't your fight. Elena isn't your responsibility. Take the money and walk away while you still can." Caleb lowered the rifle slightly, just enough to look less threatening. Then he said, "You know what the problem is with people like you." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You think everything has a price. You think if you throw enough money around, people will do whatever you want. But some things don't work that way." "Everything has a price," Richard said coldly. "Not this." Richard's face went hard. "Then you're a fool." "Probably. She's going to lose, you know. The evaluation will come back exactly the way I want it to. The judge will rule in our favor, and when that happens, she'll have nothing. Maybe, but at least she'll still have her daughter. Not for long." Caleb's grip on the rifle tightened. "You threatening her again?" "I'm stating facts. The child belongs with the Cross family. One way or another, that's where she'll end up." "Over my dead body." Richard smiled again, but there was no warmth in it. "That can be arranged." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Caleb felt something cold settle in his gut. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a warning. "Get out of here," Caleb said quietly. Richard held his gaze for another moment, then turned and walked away. His men followed, melting back into the shadows. Caleb stood there for a long time, watching the empty street, before he finally went back inside. Elena was waiting at the top of the stairs, hope clutched to her chest. "What did he want?" she asked. "To buy me off." "And?" "I told him no." Elena's shoulders sagged with relief, but her eyes were still scared. "He's not going to stop." "I know. So what do we do?" Caleb didn't have an answer. Not one that made sense, anyway. They were trapped, too deep in to back out, but not strong enough to win outright. The evaluation results would come any day now, and when they did, everything would either break their way or collapse completely. "We wait," he said finally, "and we stay ready." The results came 3 days later. Brennan showed up at the general store early in the morning, his face unreadable. Caleb's stomach dropped the moment he saw him. "What's the verdict?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brennan handed her a folded paper. "Mixed." Elena unfolded it with shaking hands and read. Her face went pale. "What does it say?" Caleb asked. One doctor says I'm fit. The other says I'm not. So it's a split decision, which means the judge gets to decide. Elena looked up at Brennan. What are the odds he rules in my favor? Brennan hesitated. Honestly, 50-50. Harper's fair, but he's also cautious. If he thinks there's any risk to the child, he'll err on the side of the Cross family. Elena sat down heavily, still holding the paper. So we didn't win anything. We didn't lose either, Brennan said. And that's something. But it didn't feel like something. It felt like stalling, like running in place while the ground crumbled beneath them. That afternoon, Brennan received word that the final hearing had been moved up. Instead of 2 weeks, they had 3 days. Why the change? Caleb asked. Cross family pushed for it. They want this over with. Can they do that? They've got influence. Harper agreed to it, so yeah, they can. Elena looked like she was going to be sick. 3 days. That's not enough time. It's what we've got. Brennan started gathering his papers. I'll do everything I can, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that this doesn't go our way. After he left, Elena sat in silence for a long time. Then she said, I need to leave. Caleb looked at her. What? If the judge rules against me, they'll take Hope. I can't let that happen. Elena, if you run now, you'll look guilty. Harper will rule against you for sure. I don't care how I look. I care about keeping her safe. And you think running will do that? They'll hunt you down. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. At least I'll have her. Caleb crossed the room and crouched in front of her. Listen to me. If you run, you lose everything. The case, your credibility, any chance of a normal life. But if you stay, if you fight this through, there's still a chance. Elena's eyes filled with tears. What if there isn't? Then we'll deal with it, together. She looked at him, searching his face for something. Certainty, maybe, or a promise he couldn't make. But whatever she found seemed to be enough, because she nodded. Okay, she whispered. I'll stay. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Brennan worked around the clock, gathering statements, refining arguments, building the strongest case he could. Caleb stayed close to Elena, keeping watch, making sure no one else tried anything. But on the night before the hearing, something happened that changed everything. Caleb was out getting supplies when he ran into Sheriff Dalton in the street. The older man looked tired, his face lined with something that might have been guilt. We need to talk, Dalton said. They walked to a quiet corner, and Dalton pulled out a folded envelope. This came to my office an hour ago, he said, handing it over. Anonymous, but I know who sent it. Caleb opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a contract dated 6 months ago, signed by Richard Cross and a man named Marcus Hale. The contract outlined payment for services rendered, and the services were described in cold clinical terms: removal of Elena Cross and disposal of evidence. Caleb's blood went cold. This is a murder contract. Yeah. Where did you get this? Like I said, anonymous. But my guess? Someone in the Cross family got cold feet. Maybe one of the men who was there that night. Maybe someone who's had enough. Caleb stared at the paper. This is proof. Real proof. It is. And if Brennan presents it in court tomorrow, it changes everything. Why are you giving this to me and not him? Dalton's expression was grim. Because if this goes public, Richard Cross will know someone betrayed him. And whoever that someone is, they're a dead man. I need you to understand that before you use it. You're saying we shouldn't? I'm saying you need to think about what happens next. If you bring this to court, you might win, but you'll also start a war. Caleb looked down at the paper again, his mind racing. This was everything they needed. Concrete evidence that the Cross family had planned to kill Elena. It would destroy their defense, maybe even land Richard in prison. But Dalton was right. It would also escalate things beyond the courtroom. Men like Richard Cross didn't just roll over when they lost. They struck back. Hard. I need to talk to Elena, Caleb said. He found her back at the room, feeding Hope. When he showed her the contract, her face went white. This is it, she said. This proves everything. Yeah. So we use it tomorrow. Elena, if we do this, Richard will come after us with everything he's got. He won't stop until... I don't care. Her voice was sharp, final. I don't care what he does. This is proof that he tried to have me killed. If we don't use it, all of this was for nothing. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to find another way, but he also knew she was right. Okay, he said, we use it. The morning of the final hearing was clear and cold. The courthouse was packed again, even more crowded than before, and the air buzzed with tension. Caleb and Elena sat at the front, the contract hidden in Brennan's briefcase. The young lawyer looked nervous but determined, his hands steady as he arranged his papers. On the other side, Vincent Moss sat with Richard Cross and his legal team, all of them looking confident, like they'd already won. Judge Harper entered and the room went silent. This is the final hearing to determine custody of the minor child known as Hope Cross, Harper said. We'll hear closing arguments from both sides, review the evidence, and I'll make my ruling. Let's begin. Moss stood first. He spoke smoothly, reiterating all the points he'd made before. Elena's instability, her unfitness, the family's right to raise their own blood. He painted a picture of a grieving widow who'd lost her mind and needed help, not a child. The Cross family has only ever acted in the best interest of this child, Moss concluded. They're prepared to provide her with a safe, stable home, with every advantage in life. Can Miss Cross say the same? He sat down, looking satisfied. Brennan stood. He started with the facts. Elena's testimony, the scars, Caleb's account of finding her. He built the case carefully, methodically, and Caleb could see some of the jury starting to lean forward, listening. Then Brennan paused. Your Honor, he said, I have new evidence I'd like to submit. Moss was on his feet immediately. Objection. Any new evidence should have been submitted days ago. This evidence only came to light last night, Brennan said, and it's critical to the case. Harper frowned. What kind of evidence? Brennan pulled out the contract and handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. Harper read it, his expression darkening with every line. Then he looked up at Richard Cross. Mr. Cross, are you familiar with this document? Richard's face had gone pale. I've never seen that before. It has your signature. It's a forgery. We can verify that easily enough. Harper turned to Moss. Do you want to make a statement on behalf of your client? Moss looked rattled for the first time. Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess to review this document. Denied. Answer the question. Moss hesitated, then said, My client maintains that this document is fraudulent and has no bearing on this case. Harper's eyes narrowed. Mr. Moss, this document outlines a payment for the murder of Elena Cross. If it's authentic, your client is facing criminal charges far beyond this custody dispute. The courtroom erupted, people shouting, gasping, the bailiff calling for order. Richard stood, his face twisted with rage. This is a setup. Someone planted that. Sit down, Mr. Cross, Harper said sharply. Richard didn't sit. He turned to Moss, hissing something too low to hear, and Moss grabbed his arm, pulling him back into his seat. Harper banged his gavel until the room quieted. Then he said, I'm calling a recess. Bailiff, take this document to the county prosecutor. I want it examined immediately. As the room cleared, Richard Cross stood and walked straight toward Elena. Caleb stepped between them. Get out of my way, Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. No. Richard's hand moved toward his belt, and Caleb's hand moved toward his rifle. Don't, Caleb said quietly. For a long moment they stood there, locked in place. Then Dalton appeared, flanked by 2 deputies. That's enough, Dalton said. Mr. Cross, you need to leave. Now. Richard stared at Caleb for another moment, then turned and walked out, his men following. But as he reached the door, he looked back at Elena. This isn't over, he said. The recess lasted 2 hours. When they were called back, Harper looked grim. The document has been verified as authentic, he said. Mr. Richard Cross, you're being charged with conspiracy to commit murder. You'll be taken into custody pending trial. The courtroom exploded again. Richard's lawyers started shouting, Dalton moved forward with handcuffs, and Richard himself looked like he was about to do something violent. But he didn't. He just stood there, staring at Elena with pure hatred in his eyes as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Harper turned to Elena. Miss Cross, in light of this evidence, I'm ruling in your favor. Custody of Hope Cross is granted to you, effective immediately. Elena's knees buckled, and Caleb caught her before she fell. She was crying, her whole body shaking with relief. "It's over," she whispered. "It's over." But Caleb knew better. He saw the look on Richard's face as he was led away, saw the way his men lingered outside, watching. It wasn't over, not even close. That night, Brennan came to their room with a bottle of whiskey and a warning. "Richard Cross made bail 2 hours ago," he said. Elena's face went pale. "How?" "Family put up the money. He's out, and he's angry." "What does that mean for us?" "It means you need to be careful, very careful." Caleb looked at Elena. "We need to leave Silver Creek." "And go where?" "Somewhere they can't find us." "They'll find us anywhere." "Not if we're smart about it." Brennan set down the whiskey. "There's another option." "What?" Richard's arrest opened up a lot of questions. The prosecutor is looking into the rest of the family now. If enough people come forward, if enough evidence surfaces, the whole thing could collapse. How long would that take? Months. Maybe longer. Elena shook her head. "We don't have months." "Then you need to decide," Brennan said. "Stay and fight, or run and hope they don't catch you." After he left, Elena and Caleb sat in silence. Finally, Elena said, "I can't keep running. I can't keep looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life." "So we stay." "And if they come for us again?" Caleb picked up his rifle. "Then we fight." Elena looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. "You'd really do that? Risk everything for us?" "I already have." She reached for his hand, and he took it. "I love you," she said quietly. Caleb's breath caught. He'd thought it before, felt it growing over the months they'd been together, but hearing her say it made it real in a way that scared him. "I love you too," he said. Elena smiled, and for a moment the fear and exhaustion faded from her face. Then Hope started crying, and the moment broke. Elena stood, picked up the baby, and rocked her gently. Caleb watched them, and something settled in his chest, a decision he didn't need to think about. He was done running, done drifting. This was his family now, and he would protect them, no matter what it cost. The attack came 2 nights later. Caleb woke to the sound of breaking glass. He was on his feet before his brain fully processed what was happening, rifle in hand, moving toward the window. There were men outside, 4 of them, maybe more, moving toward the building. "Elena, get Hope and get out the back," he said. She didn't argue, just grabbed the baby and ran. Caleb fired through the broken window, and one of the men dropped. The others scattered, taking cover behind barrels and carts. Gunfire erupted, bullets punching through the walls, and Caleb moved fast, keeping low, returning fire whenever he saw movement. He heard Elena scream from the back room, and his heart stopped. He ran, bursting through the door just in time to see a man climbing through the back window. Elena was pressed against the wall, holding Hope, and the man was reaching for her. Caleb didn't hesitate. He swung the rifle like a club, catching the man across the jaw. The man went down hard, and Caleb hit him again for good measure. "Go!" he shouted at Elena. She ran, and Caleb followed, firing behind them as they burst out into the alley. More men appeared at the other end, blocking their escape. Caleb grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her into a side street, running blind, just trying to put distance between them and the gunfire. They made it 3 blocks before Caleb realized they were being herded. The men weren't trying to kill them, they were driving them toward something. Caleb skidded to a stop, pulling Elena back just as a wagon rolled into view, blocking the street ahead. Richard Cross stepped out. He had a gun in his hand, and his face was calm, almost serene. "End of the line," he said. Caleb raised his rifle, but before he could fire, something hit him from behind. Pain exploded across the back of his skull, and the world tilted sideways. The last thing he heard was Elena screaming. Then everything went dark. Caleb woke to cold water hitting his face. His head was pounding, vision blurry, and it took him a moment to realize his hands were tied behind his back. He was on his knees in what looked like a barn, the smell of hay and old wood thick in the air. Richard Cross stood in front of him, holding an empty bucket. "Welcome back," Richard said. Caleb's eyes swept the room. Elena was tied to a post across from him, Hope clutched in her arms. The baby was crying, and Elena's face was streaked with tears, but she looked unharmed. "Let them go," Caleb said, his voice rough. Richard set down the bucket and pulled up a chair, sitting so he was eye level with Caleb. You've caused me a lot of problems. Good. Richard's expression didn't change. That contract you found? It's created complications, legal complications. My family's reputation is at stake. You mean your freedom? That too. Richard leaned forward. But here's the thing. Without you and Elena, that contract doesn't mean much. No witnesses, no testimony, just a piece of paper that could have been forged. Caleb's stomach went cold. You're going to kill us. I'm going to make you disappear. There's a difference. People know where we are. Dalton, Brennan, half the town. We'll assume you ran, that you couldn't handle the pressure and decided to start over somewhere else. Richard smiled. It's what drifters do, isn't it? Caleb tested the ropes around his wrists. They were tight, professional. Whoever tied them knew what they were doing. What about Hope? Caleb asked. She'll be raised properly, with the family she belongs to. You mean the family that tried to kill her mother? Richard's smile faded. Her mother is unstable. The courts will see that once you're both gone. Elena's voice cut through the barn, stronger than Caleb expected. You won't get away with this. Richard stood and walked over to her. I already have. He reached for Hope, and Elena twisted away, shielding the baby with her body. Don't touch her, Elena said through gritted teeth. Richard grabbed her arm, trying to pull Hope away, and Elena fought back. She kicked, thrashed, and screamed, and for a moment it looked like she might actually break free. Then Richard backhanded her across the face. The sound echoed through the barn, and Elena's head snapped to the side. Blood trickled from her split lip, but she didn't let go of Hope. Caleb lunged forward, but the ropes held him in place. I'll kill you, he said, his voice shaking with rage. Richard turned to him, unfazed. You'll try. He nodded to one of his men, Marcus, the same one who'd stabbed Elena months ago. Marcus stepped forward, pulling a knife from his belt. Make it quick, Richard said, and clean. I don't want a mess. Marcus moved toward Caleb, and Caleb's mind raced. He had maybe 10 seconds to figure something out, or this was over. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats, a lot of them. Richard heard it too. He turned toward the barn door, frowning, and one of his men ran to the window. Someone's coming, the man said. Who? Looks like the sheriff, and he's got a whole group with him. Richard's face darkened. How many? 15, maybe 20. Richard cursed under his breath. He grabbed Hope from Elena's arms, ignoring her screams, and turned to Marcus. Take the child and go. Use the back exit. What about them? Marcus gestured to Caleb and Elena. Leave them. We'll deal with this later. Marcus hesitated, then grabbed Hope and headed for the rear of the barn. Elena screamed and tried to stand, but she was still tied to the post. No, give her back! Richard followed Marcus, and the other men scattered, some heading for horses, others for the back door. Caleb twisted against the ropes, feeling them bite into his wrists. He could hear Dalton's voice outside now, shouting orders, and then the barn door burst open. Dalton came through first, shotgun raised, followed by a group of men Caleb recognized from town. Shopkeepers, ranch hands, even Judge Harper, all of them armed. Where's Cross? Dalton demanded. Caleb jerked his head toward the back. He's got the baby. Went out the rear. Dalton didn't hesitate. He shouted orders, and half the men ran toward the back of the barn while the others started cutting Caleb and Elena free. The moment the ropes fell away, Caleb grabbed a rifle from one of the men and ran. He burst out the back door into the cold night air and saw Marcus on horseback, Hope bundled in one arm, riding hard toward the tree line. Richard was mounting his own horse, and two other men were already racing ahead. Caleb raised the rifle and fired. The shot missed, kicking up dirt behind Marcus's horse, and the man spurred faster. Caleb ran after them on foot, but he was too slow. They were going to make it to the trees, and once they did, tracking them in the dark would be nearly impossible. Then another shot rang out. It came from the side, and Marcus's horse stumbled. The man lurched forward, barely managing to keep his seat, and the horse slowed, limping. Caleb looked and saw Elena standing at the barn door, holding a pistol with both hands, her face set in grim determination. She'd hit the horse. Marcus turned, saw he wasn't going to make it, and made a decision. He pulled the horse to a stop, dismounted, and held Hope up like a shield. "Stay back!" he shouted. "I'll drop her, I swear!" Caleb froze. He was maybe 30 yards away, too far for a clean shot, and in the dark, There was no way to be sure he wouldn't hit the baby. Behind him, Dalton and the others came running out, but they stopped too when they saw the situation. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Elena stepped forward. "Marcus," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You don't want to do this. Stay back. You're not a monster. I know you're not." Marcus's hands were shaking. "You don't know anything about me. I know Richard pays you to do terrible things. I know you were there the night he tried to have me killed, but I also know you didn't want to do it. You're wrong. Am I?" Elena took another step. "Then why didn't you finish the job? You stabbed me and left me to die, but you didn't make sure. You could have slit my throat, could have put a bullet in me, but you didn't." Marcus's face twisted with something that might have been guilt. "Shut up. You left me alive because you couldn't do it, because somewhere inside you knew it was wrong." I said, "Shut up." Elena was close now, maybe 15 feet away. "You can still walk away from this. You can still do the right thing. There's no walking away. Cross will kill me. Not if he's in prison. He won't go to prison. Men like him never do. He will this time. We have proof. We have witnesses. He's done." Marcus looked at her, then at Caleb, then at the men surrounding him. His hands were still shaking, and hope was starting to squirm in his grip. "Please," Elena said softly, "give me my daughter." For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. Then he lowered his arms and held out the baby. Elena rushed forward and took Hope, cradling her close, and the relief that washed over her face was so strong it almost broke Caleb's heart. Marcus stood there, empty-handed, looking lost. Dalton moved forward, cuffing him without resistance. Richard Cross was caught trying to cross the river. He'd made it halfway across when one of Dalton's men spotted him and fired a warning shot. Richard's horse reared, throwing him into the freezing water, and by the time he dragged himself to the bank, there were 5 rifles pointed at him. He didn't fight, didn't say a word, just stared at Dalton with cold, dead eyes as the handcuffs clicked shut for the second time. They brought everyone back to Silver Creek as the sun was rising. The town was already awake, people lining the streets, watching as Richard Cross was led into the sheriff's office in chains. Elena stood on the courthouse steps, holding Hope, and Caleb stood beside her. They were exhausted, bruised, and covered in dirt, but they were alive. Brennan appeared looking like he hadn't slept in days. "It's over," he said. "The prosecutor has enough to put Richard away for life. And with Marcus's testimony, they're going after the rest of the family too." Elena closed her eyes. "It's really over?" "It's really over." She let out a breath she'd been holding for months and leaned into Caleb. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her and Hope both, and for the first time since this whole thing started, he let himself believe it. The trial took 3 months. Richard Cross fought every step of the way, but the evidence was overwhelming. The contract, Marcus's testimony, Elena's scars, Caleb's account. Even some of Richard's own men turned on him once they realized the ship was sinking. In the end, the jury took less than 2 hours to convict him of conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 30 years. The rest of the Cross family tried to hold on, but the scandal broke them. Their businesses collapsed, their reputation shattered, and one by one, they either left town or faded into obscurity. Elena was granted full custody of Hope, with no challenges and no appeals. Judge Harper made it official in a quiet ceremony, and when he handed her the papers, he said, "You're a hell of a fighter, Miss Cross. That little girl is lucky to have you." Elena cried, and Caleb held her through it. After the trial, they had a choice to make. "We could stay here," Elena said one night. They were sitting on the porch of the small house they'd rented in Silver Creek, watching Hope crawl across the floor. "People know us now. We have friends. A community." "We could," Caleb agreed. "Or we could start fresh. Somewhere no one knows our story." Elena looked at him. "What do you want?" Caleb thought about it. He'd spent so many years running from places that didn't feel like home, always moving, always looking for something he couldn't name. But sitting here, with Elena beside him and Hope reaching for his hand, he realized he'd found it. "I want to stay," he said. "If you do?" Elena smiled. "Yeah, I do." So they stayed. Caleb found work at a ranch outside town, steady pay and decent hours. Elena started working at the general store, and Mrs. Garrett watched Hope during the day. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, safe, and slowly, piece by piece, they built a life. 6 months after the trial, Caleb asked Elena to marry him. It wasn't romantic. They were doing dishes, Hope asleep in the next room, and the words just came out. "I think we should get married," he said. Elena paused, hands still in the soapy water. "That a proposal?" "Yeah. Not much of one." Caleb smiled. "I'm not much of a romantic." Elena dried her hands and turned to face him. "You saved my life. You fought for me when no one else would. You gave up everything to stand by my side." She reached up and touched his face. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever done." "So is that a yes?" "It's a yes." They were married a month later in Judge Harper's office, with Dalton and Mrs. Garrett as witnesses. Elena wore a simple dress, and Caleb borrowed a clean shirt. Hope fussed through the whole ceremony, and when Harper pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed Elena while their daughter tried to grab his nose. It was small and imperfect and exactly right. Life didn't become easy after that. They still struggled with money sometimes, still had bad days. Elena had nightmares about the attack, and there were nights when she'd wake up panicking, convinced someone was coming for Hope. Caleb had his own demons. He'd spent so long alone that sometimes being part of a family felt foreign, like he was playing a role he didn't quite understand. There were moments when he'd think about leaving, about going back to the drifting life he knew. But he never did, because every time that thought crossed his mind, he'd look at Elena or Hope, and he'd remember what it felt like to have nothing, to be no one. And he'd realize that this, messy and complicated and hard as it was everything he'd ever wanted. Hope grew fast. By her first birthday, she was walking, babbling nonsense words that Elena swore were almost sentences. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's, Thomas's, sharp eyes, but her laugh was all her own. Caleb loved her like she was his. He taught her to count by stacking blocks, taught her the names of animals by pointing them out when they rode past the ranch. And when she took her first real steps, it was toward him, her tiny hands reaching out for balance. Elena watched from the doorway, and when Caleb caught Hope and lifted her up, spinning her around while she giggled, Elena's eyes filled with tears. "What?" Caleb asked. "Nothing," Elena said. "Just happy." 2 years after the trial, they bought a piece of land just outside Silver Creek. It wasn't much, 10 acres, a stream running through it, and enough flat ground for a house. They built it themselves, with help from neighbors. Caleb did most of the framing, and Elena handled the details. Where the windows should go, how big the kitchen needed to be, where Hope's room would face so she'd get morning light. It took 6 months, but when it was done, it was theirs. The first night they slept there, Caleb lay awake listening to the sounds of the house settling. Elena was curled against him, one arm draped across his chest, and Hope was asleep in the next room. For the first time in his life, Caleb felt like he'd stopped running. He thought about the man he'd been when he found Elena tied to that post, empty, directionless, going through the motions of living without ever really feeling alive. And he thought about the choice he'd made that day, the choice to stop, to help, to get involved even though it would have been easier to ride away. It had cost him, almost cost him everything, but it had also given him everything. One evening, when Hope was 3, Caleb found her sitting on the porch with Elena, looking out at the sunset. "What are you two doing?" he asked. "Watching the sky," Elena said. "Hope says it looks like it's on fire." Caleb sat down beside them, and Hope immediately climbed into his lap. "Papa," she said. She'd started calling him that a few months ago, and it still caught him off guard every time. "Yeah, sweetheart?" "Mama says you saved us." Caleb glanced at Elena, who shrugged. "Is that true?" Hope asked. Caleb thought about how to answer that. He could tell her the simple version that he'd found them and brought them home. But that wasn't really the truth. The truth was that they'd saved each other. "Your mama's the one who saved us," Caleb said. "She's the bravest person I know." Hope considered this, then nodded like it made perfect sense. Elena reached over and took Caleb's hand, squeezing it gently. They sat there in silence, watching the sky burn red and orange, and Caleb realized something. This was it. This was what he'd been looking for all those years without knowing it. Not wealth, not adventure, not some grand purpose. Just this. A family, a home, a reason to wake up every morning and try to be better than he was the day before. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was enough. Years passed, and the story of what happened with the Cross family faded into local legend. People still talked about it sometimes. The woman who fought back, the drifter who stood his ground, the family that fell from grace. But for Caleb and Elena, it became just another part of their past. Something they'd survived. Something that had shaped them but didn't define them anymore. Hope grew into a smart, stubborn girl who loved horses and hated dresses and asked too many questions. She had her mother's fire and a streak of independence that sometimes terrified Caleb. "She's going to be a handful," Elena said one day, watching Hope argue with another kid about whose turn it was on the swing. "Wonder where she gets that," Caleb said. Elena elbowed him, but she was smiling. When Hope was 7, she came home from school and asked about her father. "My real father," she clarified. "The one who died." Elena and Caleb had known this conversation was coming. They'd talked about how to handle it, what to say. But sitting across from their daughter, seeing the genuine curiosity in her eyes, Elena found the words easier than she'd expected. "His name was Thomas," Elena said, "and he wasn't a good man." Hope frowned. "Why not?" "Because he let other people make him cruel. He forgot how to be kind." "Did you love him?" Elena paused. "I thought I did, but I didn't really know what love was until I met your papa." Hope looked at Caleb. "Papa's not my real father?" "He's as real as it gets," Elena said firmly. "He chose to be your father, and that's more important than blood." Hope thought about this for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." And that was it. She never asked about Thomas again. When Caleb turned 40, Elena threw him a party. It was small, just close friends, Dalton, Brennan, Mrs. Garrett, and a few neighbors, but it was loud and full of laughter. At some point in the evening, Dalton pulled Caleb aside. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd ridden past that day?" Dalton asked. Caleb looked across the room at Elena, who was dancing with Hope, both of them laughing. "Yeah," he said, "I think about it sometimes." "And?" "And I'm glad I didn't." Dalton nodded. "You're a good man, Caleb Ward." Caleb shook his head. "I'm just a man who got lucky." "Luck's got nothing to do with it. You made a choice. You stood up when it would have been easier to walk away. That's not luck. That's character." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and Hope was asleep, Caleb and Elena sat on the porch. "You happy?" Elena asked. "Yeah," Caleb said. "You?" "More than I ever thought I'd be." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat there in comfortable silence, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of the stream. "I love you," Elena said. "I love you too." And in that moment, with the stars overhead and his family safe inside, Caleb Ward knew something with absolute certainty. He'd stopped drifting. He'd found home. And he was never letting it go. The scars never fully disappeared. Elena still had the line across her ribs, faded but visible. Caleb still had the memories of that night in the barn, the feeling of helplessness as Marcus held a knife. But scars were just proof you'd survived something, and they had survived. More than that, they'd built something out of the wreckage, something strong and real and worth fighting for. Hope grew up hearing stories about bravery, not the kind in fairy tales, but the kind that looked like her mother refusing to give up, like her father choosing to stand his ground when everyone said he should run. She learned that family wasn't just about blood. It was about who showed up, who stayed, who chose you every single day. And she learned that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing were the same thing. Years later, when Hope had children of her own, she'd tell them about the grandmother who fought an empire and won, about the grandfather who'd been a drifter until he found something worth staying for. She'd tell them that people could change, that you could be lost and then found, that you could be broken and still put yourself back together. And she'd tell them that love, real love, wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up. It was about choosing each other, even when it was hard. It was about building a life together, one difficult day at a time, until those days turned into years and those years turned into a lifetime. Caleb Ward died at 68, in the house he'd built, surrounded by the family he'd chosen. Elena held his hand as he went, and the last thing he heard was her voice, steady and sure, telling him she loved him. Hope was there too, along with her own children, and they all said goodbye to the man who'd taught them what it meant to stand your ground. At the funeral, people came from all over the county. Friends, neighbors, people whose lives Caleb had touched without even realizing it. They told stories about a quiet man who worked hard, who kept his word, who'd once stood between a woman and the people who wanted to hurt her. And they said he was a good man. Caleb would have disagreed. He never saw himself as good, just as someone who'd tried. But maybe that was enough. Elena lived another 12 years after Caleb passed. She spent them with Hope and her grandchildren, working in the garden Caleb had built, sitting on the porch he'd constructed with his own hands. And every evening as the sun set, she'd think about the drifter who'd found her in the wasteland and given her a second chance at life. She'd think about the choice he'd made, the choice they'd both made, to fight, to stay, to build something that lasted. And she'd smile, because despite everything, despite the pain and the fear and the impossible odds, they'd won. Not because they were perfect, not because it was easy, but because they'd refused to give up. And in the end, that made all the difference.